Welcome to Chapter 7, a geographic profile of South and East Asia. In this geographic profile, we're going to cover about a quarter of the Earth's landmass and about half of the world's population. This region here is subdivided into East, South, and Southeast Asia. I imagine you can kind of gather where East, South, and Southeast Asia are from looking at this picture, right? Probably not too difficult. My chat window went away. Come back here, you. Here is the graphic. We see a lot of these chapters comparing the size and location of the East Asia region to the continental United States, showing the massive size. China and India are both gigantic countries, on par or exceeding the United States. Other things that you may not be aware of, Japan's actually a very large country. Japan's about as tall as the United States is. Other various ones, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, these are not necessarily small countries, right? A lot of these are quite massive. Mongolia is a very large country, etc., etc. And as you can see, we do have some getting rather high there, but the majority of what we're talking about is below the continental United States, approaching and even going past the equator. Demographic heavyweight, right? As I said before, this region includes, at the time of this writing, it's even larger now, over half the world's population. China and India are massive, massive populations, each having, I think, 1.5 billion now at this point. Between those two countries, you're approaching 3 billion people. And also very, very populous cities, very high urban densities in Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, Tokyo, Beijing, Delhi, the list goes on, right? Population distributions, even you have a lot of people, you have a lot of land, but you have a lot of people, right? China and India, especially, massive populations. Interesting note here, you do not see the trends you see in previous regions of dense populations solely being along major waterways. India, for example, has a large swath of dense population at the top of its country, right? China's dense population is slowly moving inwards. So something to keep into account. My chat apparently isn't staying on top of my screen, just so you guys know. If you ask something in chat, maybe raise your hand or something like that, the way I can see your question, because it's just not staying for me to see. I apologize. Cartogram, has shown before, pretty basic. China, India, gigantic, but other countries aren't necessarily small in population size either. All right, population growth patterns. Let's talk about that. You can't really generalize the population growth patterns of this area. They also call this monsoon Asia. We'll get to that in a bit if you don't know what monsoon is, but that's an accurate way to describe this part of the world. Some of these countries have slow to negative population growth, such as Japan. Some of these countries have gigantic population growth, such as shown here with Timor. A lot of less developed countries, but a few big, major, more developed countries in here to counteract that. It's very much a tale of two cities conversation going on here. China, of course, being a very big player in this game, and India as well. And then, of course, Japan. We'll get into all these things. Basic data chart, as usual, a very interesting chart, shows a lot of information. Again, this chart is technically out of date. David, what's up? Let me try to get to the chat. Oh, I see a question there. Is China's one-child policy still in effect? Technically, no, but we'll get to that in a bit when we talk about it, because that's a whole can of worms that's worth knowing about. So, good question. As I said, we'll talk more about that at the end of this. Yeah, take a second, run through this, right? You can see just stupid population densities. Those fourth and fifth, those center columns of population density in Singapore stands out as just being a stupid amount of people for how small the area is. 26,000 people per square mile, right? But there's a lot of diversity here. Bhutan, small country, very low population. Mongolia, large country, very low population, 5 people per square mile in Mongolia, right? But it's a very large country as well. So yeah, a lot going on here. All right, we always, as usual, start with the physical geography of the area, then move slowly over to the economic human side of things. So we have an inner arc, a middle arc, and an outer arc going on here. And the inner arc in Asia is consistent of the world's highest mountain range, the Himalayas, you've probably heard of that, various plateaus and basins. We move out from from the Himalayas, we get into smaller mountains, hills, river plains, things along that nature. And then as we travel out further into Southeast Asia, approaching Oceania, we run into our archipelagos and our oceans and seas. This part of the world is called in this book and other places monsoon Asia. It's called that because the vast majority of this particular region of the world is characterized by warm, well-watered climates, tropical, rain, humid, things of that nature. Your desert steppe subarctic is essentially Mongolia and the top of China and Hokkaido. That's about it. You go to most other parts of the world here, if it's not mountain that you're in a very tropic, very humid condition. This climate map shows kind of what I was just saying there, right? Lots of tropical savanna, humid subtropical, tropical. The word tropical is appearing a lot in these. We again are at or below the equator, hottest part of the world. The equator is where you get a lot of your tropics. Like that's where they exist, right? Between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn exist the tropics. You don't really have your less humid regions, with the exception of, again, if we go approaching the Middle East there on the west of India, you get your desert because you get your in Pakistan, Afghanistan, right? And if you go up top northern China, Mongolia is desert and steppe highland area. So, but we call this monsoon because the majority of the population lives in a highly watered, highly humid climate. Biome map, as usual, ties in very nicely with the climate map. You're getting the biomes you would expect. What are you going to expect in tropical climate? Tropical rainforest, right? We do run into prairies, as I said before, and I show pictures of Mongolia. You're going to see a prairie that looks sort of similar to, say, the western part of the United States, right? Montana area. And there's a reason for that, right? Look at that latitude. But these maps go together. They tell you a lot about each other, right? We've talked about this a lot before. All these pieces interconnect very well. So let's talk a bit about monsoons. When I say monsoon, what do I mean? The monsoons are the prevailing sea to land and land to sea winds. You have a wet summer monsoon that is very high in humidity, very moist, and lots of rain. And then a dry winter monsoon where the land loses its warmth while the sea and the coastal waters stay warm a bit longer. The winds shift, air masses flow from the inner areas to the sea, and you get a longer dry season. I actually lived in Japan for a while, and I experienced this monsoon climate change. And I'll tell you, it is incredible, as someone that's lived in Michigan the majority of my life, to have months of solid rain wherein you don't get a break. You still have to go about your day-to-day life, but it's raining all the time. And the architecture of the city, we'll get into that stuff, the architecture of the cities are built for that. Every single street that you walk on has large drain gutters on the sides of it so that the water has someplace to go, right? Everyone has lots of umbrellas because you just need that kind of stuff. So anyways, that's what a monsoon is. Essentially, you've probably heard the term rainy season, kind of synonymous here. Here's an example of some of the monsoon flows, monsoon air flows. Over the summer, the heat from the ocean comes in. Over the winter, the heat from the continents leaches back out, right? So the water comes in and then the water slowly leaves. Monsoon rains, right? This is I would imagine, given that this is a road that you're looking at the left here, this not always look this way. However, during monsoon conditions, you get very heavy rains. You get essentially regular routine flooding, so regular and routine that it's not even considered flooding anymore. It's just kind of what happens, right? Going to land use, again, this map ties perfectly in with climate and biome maps. And you can see what the place is used for. In the northern and western parts of the map, where it was the cold and the desert and the tundra area, you do get your subsistence, agriculture, and herding because you don't have the humidity, you don't have the climate to grow things. But as you get more towards the tropics, you do get, as it says on this, shifting cultivation. That shifting cultivation is essentially a product of the archipelago. You don't have the land mass to sustain the soil, to sustain the growth you need, plus the monsoons kind of wipe out plants that aren't capable of doing that. So your cultivation needs to play along very nicely with the part of the world you live in, right? You see a lot of rice subsistence. Rice is the predominant grain of this region of the world because rice can grow underwater, essentially. You don't need to worry about your rice flooding out. Rice is built to deal with that because it's from this part of the world, right? Rice paddies, of course, when you picture a rice paddy, you're picturing someone in one of those big hats wading through the water, picking up the rice. That's actually what happens. You travel through this part of the world, you see that stuff happen all the time. What else? That part of the world that says little agricultural activity in the gray there. What is that? That's the Himalayas, right? You don't get a lot of agriculture activity in the mountains. Or the nomadic herding is also part of that too. As said before, many of these soils are infertile. You have the high temperatures, the high rains, the soil simply doesn't last. Or if it does last, it usually in a jungle environment, which we'll talk about more when we get to South America. Jungle soils only really grow jungle plants, right? You can't build the soil horizon, the soil profile necessary for the mass farming we see in Europe or the Americas or something like that, because this part of the world simply doesn't allow that. So they use rice, as I was talking about before. Very intense use of rice. You produce 2 or 3 crops per year, which is vital, right? And you can sustain large populations over a long period of time by focusing mostly on rice. Beyond rice, they do obviously have lots of other veggies there. I mean, they do eat burgers and all these other things, of course, but you need to grow the food that works with the climate and biome that you're talking about. We don't have oranges up here in the UP if you live on the GCC campus, because oranges don't grow up here very well, right? You need to have your food tie in very nicely with your soil, etc., etc. You know this already. I don't need to explain this in detail to you, but it's still worth discussing. There you go, rice field in Vietnam. Honestly, as I said, when I was in Japan, oh my gosh, what, 8-9 years ago now, it didn't look very different because it doesn't really need to, right? You don't have a lot of space in this part of the world, so you don't have those large industrial farms. People still grow rice sort of in their yard, and they can grow a lot of it, and they can go very far. And that's what you do. Let's talk some agriculture. Let's talk some culture. This is slowly going to get more interesting. I'll try to include personal anecdotes and such as we go through where need be, but we're still focused most on the slides. Theory of Himalayan environmental degradation. So we're talking the Himalayas here. We're talking north of India, Western China, Nepal area. I'm sure you know what the Himalayas are. I hope you know what the Himalayas are. You went through high school. There's an overpopulation issue going on here, right? There's no room in the Himalayas to grow the food people still want to live in the Himalayas because there's a lot of room. And you also get a lot of monsoon rains going on there because what happens if it rains in the side of a mountain? The water flows down, water picks stuff up, that's where erosion happens, etc., etc. Landslides. You get a lot of issues going on here. So you have people wanting to live, for example, in the Himalayas, but how do you do that effectively? This is the kind of issues that they have over there, unique issues to the area. On that note, we can look at this data table, which we've talked about a lot. Think back, if you can, to previous data tables that we've looked at like this, like with Europe, with Russia, and with the Middle East. All of those regions had a very specific trend where there was 4 or 5 major cities, and then it just dropped down. And I believe the Middle East, for example, had 3 or 4 cities above 10 million, and everything else was like at 4 or 5 million. Asia is very different. Asia has lots and lots and lots of very large cities. So much so that this chart, with the exception of Tokyo being stupidly massive, this chart flows very nice. 20s, 19s, 15s, 10s, 9s, 7s, right? You don't have a few major hotspots of city life, of urban life. You have lots of hotspots of urban life because, again, you have half the population of the world living in this region. There's a lot of big cities. That being said, Tokyo does stand head and shoulders on top of everything else as just being huge. Tokyo is the world city, right? I think Mexico City is overtaken it for population. I could be wrong, but there's a lot of stuff going on here. And also noteworthy, when looking at population data chart, there's many different countries involved, right? There's a lot of Japanese cities, a lot of Chinese cities, a lot of Indian cities, a lot of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just a few countries because there's so many people living over there. And to further go on to that, even though there's all these cities, that's all this population. Looking at that population data chart is still not the majority of the population in this region. 62% as of making this slide. I'm sure it's close to 50-50 now, but you still have a lot of people living in rural environments. There is, of course, as with the rest of the world, a pronounced rural to urban migration. If this was up to date, if this chart was up to date, you would probably see these numbers be closer, especially with China. But there's still a lot of open land too, as we said. This is approaching 40% of the Earth's landmass in this region. Moving rural to urban, for example, here, classic rural thatched roof, clay house with electricity, a satellite dish, and all the other amenities of the modern life. All right, sweet. Talked a little bit about the populations. We could talk a little bit about the history of the area. A lot of the technology that exists in the world today is originated in this particular region. The Koreans had the first movable printing type, right? The Koreans had, that's books, essentially. The Koreans were able to print books first. The Chinese, of course, invented lots of things: gunpowder, paper, porcelain. Two of the major religions of the world, Hinduism, Buddhism, are found in this particular region. Lots of the big agriculture and meat products, such as rice, cabbage, chickens, cattle, pigs, domesticated in this part of the world. I see Jacob.
Yeah. You had said Korea invented movable type. How much was that before Johann Gutenberg?
Ooh, that'd be I want to say the Koreans had, I think Gutenberg was the 1400s, if I remember correctly. And I think the Koreans had some version of it, and I think the 1100s, so 200-300 years before. I believe, don't quote me on that, but the Koreans did have it. It just wasn't as pronounced. And again, we're talking sort of before Silk Road, before people even traveled over here. So this was sort of only in Korea.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Again, those numbers could be off, but I believe they had it a fair amount of time before. But that's saying something, right? When you think of printed text, you're probably thinking of European. We we all have grown up in schools that are very Eurocentric. The books are always very Eurocentric. They don't talk about all the developments that the rest of the world brought in because that's simply not the way things are written. It's important to learn these things. How much of the very basics of society are founded in non-European parts of the world. Of course, with every region, very complex collection of languages, right? Like you can squint to see those numbers down there. 102 distinct dialects. These are major dialects too, not counting like tribal and unique dying languages here. Very large, very massive. Indo-European families. We're also catching glimpses of other regions we talked about, such as the Middle East and Russia, and how those are all bleeding together here, right? Unique dialects at this point. When you talk about the languages of this particular region, you are breaking very far away from the Romantic and Germanic languages that English is derived from. You are getting different structures and different ways to form sentences. The grammar is different. The idea of words existing in these cultures that don't have a good one-to-one translation. That is what you find as you dive further and further away. Sort of the classic example of what's the Hawaiian word that means like hello and goodbye? That's the phrase that's always said. Aloha, there we go. Aloha means hello and goodbye. Well, in reality, aloha means a lot more than just hello and goodbye. And when we get to Oceania, we can talk about that a bit more. But the amount of different ways you can have a language is very, very much expressed if you travel outside of your own language family. Just look down there in around the Philippines, down there in the 40s, in the, I guess, peach colored archipelagos down there. Look at all the different languages showing up in those few island chains, right? You're going from the mid 20s up to the mid 50s. Huge amount of languages, all very more or less diverse and unique and interesting. And again, I would suggest worth knowing. Duolingo is free, right? Doesn't hurt to learn a bit. Talked about the languages. We talk about the religions now. The Hinduism and Buddhism, as I said before, are very pronounced, very well-known, very popular religions throughout the world. Of course, you got Confucianism, Taoism, Shintoism, some animisms, some ancestor veneration showing up in this part of the world. The religion map is a bit more complicated than previous ones. Europe and Russia, very Christian-centric, right? Middle East, North Africa, very Islam-centric. This is a bit more diverse. Lots of Hindu, lots of Buddhism, a little bit of Shinto showing up, some Muslim showing up. Christianity is scattered throughout this as well. And all very unique. Sikhism up there in northern India, very important religion. Ancestor veneration is sort of a take on animism, a very ancient religion. I'm not going to try to detail what's going on with this. If you want to know a super brief version, go watch Mulan and you get 0.01% of the concept. But we could talk more about things such as Hinduism. Hinduism is, of course, the faith that you associate most with India, right? Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, David, what's up? Oh, I see a question here. What caused Catholicism to be so popular in certain islands? Yes, good call. You see Roman Catholicism down here in this archipelago and splattered throughout. That's colonialism you're looking at right there. That's the byproduct of colonialism. When we talk about Oceania explicitly, these islands essentially, this part, the southeastern corner of this archipelago, and then going east from that into those island chains, were all property of various European countries up until like World War I, essentially. So that's Catholic for the same reason that Latin America is Catholic. I hope that kind of answers your question a bit. And again, we'll get more into this as we go, of course. Click over. There we go. Yeah, very. There's when you talk about Hinduism, there is actual Hinduism, and then there's also sort of the Eurocentric, the popular Hinduism, and the two aren't always the same thing. That girl with braids that wears beads all the time and talks about how much she loves yoga probably doesn't have a good grasp of Hinduism, to be honest with you. It is a very complicated religion, like all religions are. And if it's something you're interested in, it's very much worth knowing and learning about. Right? And great artwork, great stories, great history going on with this. Some of the creation tales are beyond amazing, right? Very interesting religion to learn about and discuss. Buddhism, the other one, of course, you probably I've heard of Buddha before, right? Every time you go into an Asian restaurant, a big statue of Buddha is there. Buddha was a real dude. This is more or less unarguable. He was a prince in northern India at the 500 BCs, and he essentially didn't like Hinduism. Hinduism's a very, very old religion, by the way. This prince, Siddhartha Gautama, I don't know, I'm mispronouncing that last name. I apologize. Decided, again, I don't know, I'm no Buddhist expert, but he had four noble truths that he thought people should follow to adjust their karma and hopefully reach nirvana, right? Buddhism is another one of those things that that chick with the braids that loves her yoga is going to tell you she's a Buddhist, but she probably doesn't actually know much about the religion. These are very much religions that people take on to be cool. The Lisa Simpson approach to these situations. Very interesting, very complicated religion, very complicated belief. Very much worth spending your time and looking into. You're going to find this to be fascinating. Picture of a Buddhist temple, right? We've all seen these images before in our media, XYZ reasons. Fascinating. We didn't talk a bit about Shinto in that, but that is also something worth learning about. Andrew, I see your question here. Do the religions in the Philippines have any factor with the separation from the United States after World War II? Ooh, that's an interesting question. What does this map call the Philippines? That's up here, Catholic. I would assume you are correct in your assessment, Andrew, on the Philippines and its religious practices. Islam is creeping through that part of the world at this moment, so that is something to take into account. But yeah, there's a lot of, as we're about to talk about here, colonial aspects to all these conversations, right? Again, why is Catholicism so popular in Latin America? Well, because the Spanish came in there, right? They speak Spanish in those countries for a reason. Moving on, we could talk about the colonization, because as with basically every region we talk about, except for Europe itself, Europe controlled it at one point. Portugal and Spain were the first to come into this part of the world, establish colonies, gather resources, etc., etc. But the British, Dutch, French, and Portuguese also came in and claimed, chopped up this part of the world. As I said before, even the United States had a colony in the Philippines for a while. That's still an ongoing conversation. Around World War One era, a lot of these colonies were sort of given up, you could argue. World War II as well, because there really wasn't the need for it anymore, and the European nations just fought two world wars. They couldn't afford to try to keep the natives down. And that harsh language is used purposefully there. Notably, Hong Kong returned to China in 1997. Macau returned to China in 1999. Those two are in the news right now. Big conversations had there. Here you go. Here's a picture of the different parts of the world and who, quote unquote, own them, right? China was being up on a lot. That doesn't really discuss it there by Korea and Japan and stuff like that. But Britain essentially controlled India, right? You've heard of Mahatma Gandhi. That's where that comes from. Your Dutch, your Portuguese, big part of the world. The East Indies Trading Company, the largest company ever to exist, people would argue, existed because the Indonesia area down there, that orange section of the world, was so rich in resources such as spices and silks and exotic fruit and chocolate, I believe, and tea, actually, was so rich in these spices the rest of the world coveted that the little country of the Netherlands became incredibly profitable. Actually, not the Netherlands, a company based in the Netherlands became so stupidly profitable by, extracting these natural resources out of that little orange strip down there. Important stuff to know and understand. And of course, nowadays, all these countries are, of course, owned by the people that live there. Lucky them. Cool. We're going to go over colonialism and basically every region we cover because it's an important way to look at things and how things have grown and developed. That being said, let's take a look at this region on a modern lens. China, very fast growing economy. At the time of the making of this slideshow, they were still a growing economy. China's basically now a MDC, a first world country, with a prominent middle class and things like that. Japan is still one of the economic powerhouses of the world. It very much has a thing to say in what goes on in the world. Of course, when you have growing economies, you have capitalism flourishing in parts of the world, you do get a wealth gap growing. China, I think, has more billionaires than any other country in the world. But there's a lot of poverty and desolation in that country as well. Gangs are very prominent in this part of the world. The Asian tigers, as it says down there, your triads, your yakuza, right? Still very heavily involved in this section of the world. When I was in Japan, I got to interact with the yakuza in a very please don't kill me sort of way. It was fascinating couple days of my life. Yeah, and of course, when you think of Asia, you probably think of quote unquote cheap products, right? And Taiwan made is the sign it's gonna break. That stuff's all very 80s, 90s. Modern Asia is a very forward-thinking, very modern economy. On paper, you're not going to be able to see a lot that distinguishes it from Europe, North America, etc. Well, at least I should say China and Japan and other countries in the world are very much catching up to that. The days of send your stuff over to have it be made in India because you can pay them 5 cents a day to do it are going away. Now you send them over to Central America, sadly. Again, a bit more about China's economy. Again, this is essentially 8-9 years ago when this slide was written. So these things essentially more or less came to pass and came out to be true. As opposed, I'm going to point this out, as opposed to when we talked about the Arab Spring, how all those revolutions in Libya and Egypt and Syria failed. The growth of China, talked about here, more or less, you could argue, succeeded in its goal of growing China. China experienced massive growth to the point where, I keep repeating myself here, you basically have a strong middle class, you can have a job, buy a car, have health insurance, etc., etc. Happy looking person there. Right, China's economic impact. Since you have so much money and investment and production going on in China, China very much is taking a prominent place in the world. some may argue China is slowly but surely becoming the epicenter and the top world economy, surpassing the United States, and again ahead of the European Union. Um, Depends on who you ask if that is true or not. Of course, Jacob, what's up?
I'm just not sure if this is, I don't know, true or not, but is there a gender disparity in China because of the effects of the one child policy? Like
Uh, yes,
significantly more men than women?
yes, and we will get to that. I believe we do talk about the one child policy at the end of this when we go
Oh,
into the specifics of the region, a couple of specific examples, and I'll go more in depth into that. That is a very fascinating conversation. So we'll,
okay.
and if I don't, remind me and we'll cover it then.
Okay.
Yep. But of course, good question, good observation. So, yep, China, super important economy. Interestingly, the current world superpowers all kind of grew up in the steam age, grew up in the coal age, grew up to the economies that they are today on the back of the fossil fuels that led the charge, right? If you watch a if you watch a movie about Britain in the 1800s, like Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist, all the kids are covered in coal dust and it looks disgusting outside the window, because industrialization happened when everyone burned coal and oil. Since China, India, these countries are becoming industrialized or growing to the level that the United States and the European Union are currently at in today's world, we have an understanding of the impact that that kind of growth can have. And we also have the technologies, as being talked about here, to deal with those issues. When America was, when I'll use Europe since we already covered that as a region. When Europe was growing, you had a very large subsect of the population that was very poor and starving and was working in the coal mines and working for pennies a day and barely enough to get by. Modern countries can take a look at this problem and try to resolve it as they grow and as the middle class grows and as they earn their money. Malaysia, Indonesia, right? They can try to deal with these issues. How can we bring up our economy, have it be strong, have it compete with Europe and America, and not essentially blow up the world like Europe and America did? Interesting solution they have there. Of course, it's not all happiness nowadays. We do need to talk about geopolitical concerns. Nuclear weapons would be a capital one. If you're a powerful nation, you need to defend yourself. The best way to defend yourself is, of course, nuclear weapons. North Korea, the most prominent example of this, a country with nuclear weapons. And it don't take a lot of bombs to essentially kill the world. Keep that in mind. It does not take a lot of work to do that. This particular region of the world also was the only part of the world that's ever felt the wrath of nuclear weapons. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course. So that is very much something to keep of interest. Japan knows firsthand what it's like to go through this. China, of course, very strong. They have nuclear weapons. India, very strong. They have nuclear weapons. Pakistan, very strong. They have nuclear weapons, etc., etc. As said before, if we looked at India, that is next to the Middle East. You do have your Islamic terrorism going on there. You are looking at this part of the world. This is where Afghanistan and Pakistan exist. Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden lived in that part of the world, right? So that is an issue you need to worry about. And the largest population of Muslims in the world is in Indonesia. That is a Southeast Asian country. That is a monsoon Asia country. Things to worry about. Security of shipping lanes. This is a reference more so, I believe, to China. As China's been growing, they want to assert their dominance in the region. The vast majority of goods still travel by boat. We talked about that when we talked about the Middle East, how to travel through the Mediterranean and Red Seas is very vital to the world's economy. So you need to have a way to transport. You need to have open water for people to transport to make their money. There's a lot of water in this part of the world, right? And a lot of people want to get their goods to China, to Japan, to Korea, etc. So you have a lot of fighting going on and a lot of puffing up your chest and blustering about who's going to control what particular seas and inlets and ports and things along that line. And as said before, this part of the world, specifically China, is very much going to be a powerhouse in all definitions. There was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm sure you remember that at the end of Obama's administration. Our current President Trump pulled us out of that. And that Trans-Pacific Partnership didn't die. China just took over as the centerpiece, and it was concluded. So now there is an open trading relationship for more or less this entire region concentrated on China. That's only bolstering them, right? Nuclear weapons testing ban. You can't test your nuclear weapons. You can't blow up your bombs to show off how powerful you are, right? 149 nations signed this. Noteworthy, India and Pakistan did not. Also, you could barely go a week without hearing about North Korea testing some missile, testing some bomb, right? But let's sidetrack North Korea and talk more about India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan are right next to each other. The northwest corner of India is Pakistan's southeast side, and they are very much at odds, very much fighting. They have religious differences, and they both want to fight over a couple pieces of land, most prominently be the province of Kashmir. They both claim ownership of it, and they both don't like each other. India and Pakistan have been in conflict for quite a while now. And this is one of those rare instances where both countries also have nuclear weapons. So on top of everything else that's ridiculous about the world we live in, if India and Pakistan decide enough is enough and want to go blow each other up, that is a very likely thing that could happen. Well, it's not very likely, but it's something that has a non-zero probability. In case you didn't know, right? Talk a bit about Pakistan here. Most of us are familiar with Pakistan, 9/11, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, etc. Osama bin Laden was actually captured and killed in Pakistan, and there's still an argument as to why the Pakistani government knew about him hiding there. Al-Qaeda is still a prominent factor going in there. So Pakistan has the Islamic terrorism of Al-Qaeda on its northwest side, and it has a constant fight with Pakistan, and it has a constant fight with India on its southeast side. Contentious part of the world there, right? Nice, happy Pakistani guy. Good for him. And this is the same region, the book argues, that China or the Philippines is. So this kind of goes a bit into definite how you can define region. It's more or less defining region here as in, if we're going to include India because it's monsoon, we got to include Pakistan because Pakistan and Afghanistan are culturally more similar to India than they are, let's say, to Saudi Arabia. Interesting conversation, right? If I told you if Afghanistani was an Indian, non-Arab, you probably would look at me kind of weird. But these have strict terms and definitions. And if you go to someone from Afghanistan and call him and say he's Arab, maybe not be happy with you. The same way that if you go to a German person and say he's a ugly Dutch man, well, I'm not Dutch, right? The same sort of conversation is being had here. North Korea, very much in the conversation at all times. The Korean War happened in the 50s. You ever watch MASH, right? That's what's going on in the show MASH. And North Korea essentially invaded South Korea to unify it, take it over. And the Americans showed up to prevent that from happening. mostly because North Korea is being backed by Russia, and this was a proxy war between Russia and the United States during their quote unquote Cold War, in which lots of people died. And North Korea never successfully took over South Korea. So this is why we have the 49th parallel, I believe, separating the two countries. And North Korea, more or less since the 70s, I believe, since the 60s or 70s, has had a cult of personality with the Kim family, Kim Jong Un, right? Kim Jong Un, I believe, is the one that's alive nowadays. Kim Jong Il was his father, and then Kim Jong Sun, I believe, was the first ruler of North Korea. That stuff going on there. As I said before, North Korea has a close relationship with China, which is why it kind of does what it wants to do, because it does a lot of economy with China. What do you do about that, right? China's become more and more powerful. China, what China wants, China kind of gets its way. So if North Korea wants to, you kind of have a little man, big man thing going on here, where North Korea kind of push a bit more than maybe it should, because it knows it has, its big friend behind its back that'll make sure no one pushes back. So there's some schoolyard politics going on with quite literally billions of people's lives. But that's the world we live in. Picture the no man's land. It's illegal for people to leave North Korea. If you try to defect North Korea and come to South Korea, they'll shoot you, which is why when you hear stories of people coming over talking about North Korea, why it's such a big deal, because they quite literally risked their lives and dodged bullets to run over here. And of course, they have a golf course there, because why wouldn't you? Most dangerous golf course in the world. Talk a bit about the archipelagos that are going on there. Indonesia, very prominent, very large population, majority Muslim, as said before. When you get to Indonesia, the Philippines, etc., you get into a unique landscape in terms of it doesn't quite comfortably fit into any particular broad category. Mostly Indonesian, but they're not in the Middle East, right? Lots of oil, but again, they're not in the Middle East. Lots of copper, but they're not in South America. Lots of important shipping lanes, but we're not talking about China here. A lot of culturally things that are not associated with the jungle and tropical environment that they live in. And I would argue sort of not as much talked about part of the world. So the infighting, the history, I can't remember the word off the top of my head. A very famous genocide happened here, the killing fields. How much control does the government have, and isn't exerting that control in a justifiable fashion? These are questions that should be had in this part of the world that kind of aren't. All right, go into a couple bullet point examples. Afghanistan. Afghanistan has a ridiculous history. They fought a war with the Soviet Union, the USSR, and beat them because the Soviet Union decided to invade a more or less desert country with a bunch of tanks that got stuck in the sand. And then they gave up on their assault. It's, in hindsight, is sort of a why do you think this would work, right? Of course, as said previously, you probably associate Afghanistan with Osama bin Laden and the 9/11 attacks. That's very much a thing that happened. The Taliban, essentially the Taliban was a government over there until America showed up with its bigger guns and didn't bring tanks like the Soviet Union did. Very strict Islamic code. I believe Afghanistan is where Malawa, I think is her name, the girl that just graduated from Harvard that had acid thrown in her face. I believe that was a Taliban response, because up until in the recent future, like, girls couldn't go to school in this part of the world. And oddly enough, the most prominent source of money for Afghanistan is poppy, which you use to make drugs. Why is that so popular there? Well, I'll let you look into that on your own. But the question of why there's so much opium and poppy going to Afghanistan, why that's so much of the nation's economy, is a quite fascinating conversation. Who am I kidding? Every single slide on this is its own fascinating conversation, right? All right, let's talk faith and secularism and the constant conflicts going on there. As said before, India and Pakistan, two very large, very powerful countries with two conflicting religions fighting over small sector of the world. But the Hindus and the Muslims fight each other in India, but that's not the only religious conflict you probably don't think about. The Buddhists and the Hindus like to fight each other in Sri Lanka. And Buddhism is not a religion of peace. There are Buddhist terrorist groups out there that fight for what they think is right. And yeah, as said here, between 1983 and 2009, more than 70,000 people have died as a result of infighting between Buddhists and Hindus in Sri Lanka. Ridiculous. 70,000 people have been killed. And these conflicts are ongoing to this day. People are still shooting each other, and not much is ever talked about it. Why is that? Well, you could come up with your own reasons, perhaps, but it is still an important thing to realize that this is actively going on all throughout the world. There's your Kashmir map. This is, of course, changed a bit since this map has grown and changed since 2013 when this slideshow was created. But yeah, there's active infighting going on between these two countries that, I will remind you, both have nuclear weapons and both want this part of the world. What do you do? Should it remind you of something? Because it should remind you of Israel and Palestine, right? Or technically, this happened in Spain not too long ago. There's conversation about this happening in America. These conflicts are happening all over the world all the time. This is happening in Africa. This is happening in South America. This is actually happening right in Israel and Palestine. Fun world we live in. The caste system is commonly brought up when you talk about India and the Hindu religion. To my knowledge, this more or less is a passe thing. The caste system was a prominent part of the government in India, where the caste system essentially says the where you were born is where you're going to stay. If your dad was a garbage man, you're in the garbage man caste, and you can't ever do anything better than that. I don't care who you marry. I don't care what you do. You can't make more money than the garbage man caste. You can't make less money, but you're not going to make more money either. Yeah, it says here's the untouchables, 20% of the Hindu population. Well, it's outlawed. This, again, as India has grown and become more modern, this is very much gone by the wayside. There are still rural parts of India where when you do have caste systems and older people that grew up in this way of life still very much, I would imagine, live by it. But it's not as big of an issue. It's more of a artifact of the past. Bit more show up in India. This, again, this slide goes to show that I should get an updated book because this information is is not necessarily 100% correct. India is a growing, developing, becoming more rich nation. There are a lot of a large population of India is very, very young and somewhat poor. That being said, steps are being made, moves are being made. India is fast becoming, similar to what China did. India is fast becoming one of the major economic powers in the world. Yeah, they have a lot of land. Lucky for them, they live in a biome where they have tropical on the bottom, arid at the top, and in between that is somewhat fertile. so they can, let's say, grow their crops and stuff like that. Something that, say, Indonesia, Philippines isn't quite able to do, as we talked about before. Bangladesh and the Maldives. Maldives is a very famous. It's a very, very foreign-owned island. It's a wealthy people's island, essentially. And Bangladesh is, again, a small, essentially a city-state. We talked about those a bit with um, Europe. However, these are both examples of countries that have to deal with climate change. As it says down there, 80% of its limited land area is less than 3 feet above sea level. So when we talked about climate change, I think in like chapter 2, and of course it's an ongoing conversation all the time, what are we going to do about rising sea levels? Rising sea levels don't mean much to you and me living here around the Gilgit Community College campuses, because we're, 5,000 miles from the sea. But if your house is quite literally on the sea, and the sea rising 2 or 3 inches means you don't have a house anymore, that's a big deal to you. You really care about rising sea levels when you live on that island in that picture, right? So the problem is these small countries don't have the economic and political clout of some of the bigger dudes who really don't care that much. So when they complain, hey, I'm literally being flooded off an island, I can't live where I've lived because of climate change, who really listens, right? It's sad. And we get to Oceania, this is going to be even more prominent. Yep, all these countries in Southeast Asia, where the cutoff is between Southeast Asia and Oceania region-wise is I don't know if I necessarily agree with what the book did in separating these two. You see down there Sumatra and stuff like that aren't included in this region. That's questionable. But anyways, lot of stuff going on here, a lot of intense history. Vietnam, of course, we would all know from the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, all very important. A lot goes on in this part of the world, and it's never ever talked about, and that's probably not a good thing. Issues with this particular part of the world: deforestation, problem throughout the world, and if you go back, 15 so years ago, you may remember a gigantic tsunami at this part of the world. A 9.3 magnitude earthquake, which is, in case you don't know geology very well, ridiculously huge, hit off the coast of Sumatra and basically destroyed this part of the world, right? 200,000 deaths, 130 of those solely Indonesia, 2 million people left homeless. And this tsunami, I mean, we can think about what Puerto Rico, with the hurricane did to Puerto Rico last year. This was on that scale, but for many, 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 many millions of people, right? Thanks to this tsunami and the massive impact, detection technologies have increased to hopefully prevent the mass catastrophe going on here. But you can look at these look at these before and after images of this tsunami, of this gigantic explosion, literally wiping entire towns into the ocean, just gone. All the people that lived in those houses don't live there anymore. And again, thanks to modern technology, you can go on YouTube and you can see videos of this gigantic wall of water smashing into these towns, and they don't exist anymore. It's fascinating. Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. This is just more depressing stuff, honestly. Constant civil war since the British gave them up in 1948. About 50 solid years of internal fighting. Foreign journalists are banned. No internet really. You can get shot just for pissing off the wrong person over there. Lots and lots of fighting, lots of death, lots and lots of destruction. This particular part of the world, heavily controlled by China. And I don't know if you've even heard of Myanmar. I think, I know this isn't where Pol Pot is from, I don't believe. But yeah, interesting part of the world, something that would behoove you to learn more about. I'm just covering it very briefly in this class because, right, this class is an overview more so than anything else. Sex, drugs, and health. There we go. Golden Triangle is found in this Southeast Asia, this archipelago part of the world. That's vernacular, of course, for Laos, Thailand, Myanmar. And it is sort of the epicenter for opium and heroin. You get a lot of drugs out of this part of the world, as I've been saying before, mostly because you get a lot of conflict and a lot of violence in this part of the world, but no one ever wants to talk about it. So if you get a lot of conflict, a lot of criminal activity, drugs, of course, going to follow. And with drugs comes sex. You get your sex traffic, your child trafficking, very prevalent in this part of the world. You don't have to go too far to find like a Vice documentary on things that will astound you that happen still in the modern day. It talks here about an AIDS epidemic going on in the world, that those things all tie in very succinctly together. Vietnam, we talked about a bit about that before. You know it best, the Vietnam War, where the communists, led by Ho Chi Minh, tried to invade and take over South Vietnam. The Americans showed up to say, no, we're gonna prevent that happening. Less so because they cared about Vietnam, more so because they didn't want the communists to win a fight, right? As it says there, Viet Cong and communist force supported by the North Vietnam tried to take over. This went very poorly. We all have heard of Vietnam. You've heard the protest music, and you've seen Forrest Gump or Apocalypse Now, right? Truth be told, this was, in hindsight, quite a bit of a disaster, right? Now Vietnam is one succinct country, as opposed to there being two Koreas, there is one Vietnam. That being said, modern day Vietnam is actually doing very well. It's a quickly rising, developing country. Modern day Vietnam is somewhat of a success story. It is not a dangerous place like Myanmar, which is, relatively close to it. You can see up there in that corner how close Myanmar, Thailand, Sri Lanka are to Vietnam, but Vietnam, conversely, is doing very well. Indonesia, we've talked a bit about Indonesia already. Very large country, lots of diverse populations going on there. Lots of, as it says, 200 dialects and/or languages are in use. And as with most other countries, a lot of stuff happening that you've never heard of because no one really cares about Southeast Asia and those archipelagos. Here we can talk about a province, Aceh. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's the northernmost tip of Sumatra, a predominantly Muslim part of the world that Indonesia hasn't been playing nice with. Divisions, arguments, what were we going to do about it? If it sounds like I'm beating the same drum over and over again, that's because I am. There's lots of conflict throughout the world over very similar debates, mostly land, religion, ethnicity. These fights happen everywhere. All right, here we go. A bit about China. China's growth involved the subjugation of people that were not ethnically Han. Han China, that is the the history of the nation of China goes back, was it some 8,000 years of recorded history? It is a massively deep and complicated conversation. That being said, it is very important to learn how and why and what China is and what it became. Learning some of the conflicts that happened, some of the way China is today very much ties into its growth and development, from essentially getting beat up by Japan and Korea up until the 1800s to Mao Zedong, and nowadays what China has become. China is surrounded by lots of autonomous regions, lots of parts and cities and stuff like that that were classically part of the Chinese Empire, but colonialism kind of chopped it all up, and then China took it back. A lot of stuff going on there. Dalai Lama, of course, a Buddhist leader, predominant in this part of the world. Uh, Something that happened in China's growth and development did, in a sense, follow the growth and development of the parts of the world we're in, right? How did America very, very much grow and develop into its modern world? Large, what's the word I'm looking for here? Large public works projects. The Three Gorges dams, for example, chopped up the Yangtze River and allowed better use of this very prominent river going through the center of China, improving the life and welfare and food consumption of this part of the world. A very large hydropower plant, etc., etc. Yeah, there's a bit about the Three Gorges River system. Cool, interesting stuff that happens. I don't know much to say about that. Water transfer. So, yeah, sadly, this particular conversation, the book found that the text found interesting. I think it's important to know that when you think of stuff like the Hoover Dam in America, other countries in the world that develop go through these same steps. This essentially is the Hoover Dam of China, wherein they wanted to grow, they wanted to develop, they wanted to use the resources in a modern, new way, and they went through the process of building what they needed to build to get there, right? And as I said many times, all of these slides very much are dated a bit because since the formation of the slideshow in the past 7 to 10 years, China basically has jumped over that loop and is now the economic powerhouse, arguably, in the world. Largest population, arguably most money, control over its particular region, connections with other places such as Russia and the Middle East and Africa. When we get to that, very important. Conversation going on here about Taiwan. This conversation will also work for Macau and Hong Kong, wherein you have parts of the world that were originally China, go back far enough, that colonialism took away, that China wants back. The one China policy is said down here. We want China to once again be China. And these parts of the world that sort of had some level of independence, again, Hong Kong, the protests Hong Kong being an excellent example of this, now, sadly, have to fight with how to work with China, and China being such a big stick, right? Talk a bit about Japan here. Japan, as we all are well aware, was bombed in World War II, chose the Axis side, lost that. And Japan went from essentially being totally defeated, losing its military, having two of its large cities utterly destroyed, went from that to 10 years later, an economic powerhouse. And that growth, that development is multifaceted in the reasons why it went the way it went. But by the mid 80s, as it says there, Japan was a huge player in the world, right? You want the best TV, you get a Japanese one. Want the best car, get a Japanese one. Want to watch anime, you got to go to Japan, right? Japan is a very unique population and its homogeneity. If you go to Japan, you're only really going to see Japanese people. And it's also a very slow growing country, right? This population chart shows you the amount of youth compared to adults. As you can see, Japan's birth rate is declining, Japan's population is declining. We've talked about this a bit with, for example, Germany and places like that. Same song and dance. North and South Korea, talked about this a lot before, and I don't need to go too much into it again. Oh, sorry, it's the 38th panel, not the 49th. Maybe 49th is Vietnam. I could be wrong. But yep, fight, Korean War happened. North Korea's, well, it's North Korea, right? And South Korea is a very popular, very populous, very robust country in of itself. Kind of a one city country, uh, like France is. Seoul, South Korea, its capital, is kind of head over shoulders above the rest of the nation. And there's nothing wrong with that. So this actually is the end of the slideshow. I thought we had a one child policy slide, but apparently we don't have to add that. So I'll pause the recording of the video, and then Jacob, if you want, we can talk a bit about the one child policy. So, all right.